The question is that these bills be now read a second time. I call the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity of participating in this debate on this group of bills in relation to the carbon tax. It won't be a matter of surprise for other honourable members to know that my constituents on the Sunshine Coast do not want me to support these bills, and in this parliament I will be voting against these bills for the reason that I don't believe that they're good for our economy and they're not good for our nation. There is no doubt that there is respectable public opinion and respectable scientific opinion both in favour and against the various propositions of man's involvement in climate change. What is not disputed is that climate has always been changing, and the reality is that climate will continue to change, and many people believe that the impact of man has accelerated that climate change in a way that is adverse. Madam Deputy Speaker, while I accept that there are contradictory scientific points of view out there, I'm quite happy personally to give the environment the benefit of the doubt, and if there is something that we collectively as a world can do to repair what we have collectively created, then that is a step very much in the right direction. So I believe there should be a world solution to a world problem. And the difficulty I have with this legislation is that the rest of the world is not following suit. And we will suffer economically to a very great extent as a nation if this package of bills becomes law and if these bills are not repealed after the next election. Sure, it will make us as a country feel good. We'll have this nice warm inner glow, believing that we are doing something to repair the world environment, but the reality is that we will suffer and inflict on ourselves the most incredible amount of pain while we will not be doing the world environment any particular benefit. And so it's a question of all pain and no gain. I'm advised that were this legislation to be implemented, that the impact on the world environment will be minimal. We are committing a form of national economic suicide, essentially in a political and economic sense, slashing our national wrists. We're exporting jobs, we're making it less viable for us to export items, and the result is that we will damage our economy and yet we will not improve the world environment. Look, I think all of us need to do whatever we can in a personal sense to improve our environment and to also make sure that we can do whatever we can to help the planet so that the future of the planet is brighter than it would otherwise be. At home, my wife Inga and I do the best that we can with respect to the little things that all households can do to help our environment. For instance, we've got a solar system on the roof. We recycle as best we can. We mulch our garden. We planted extra trees. We have an acreage block, and so there's plenty of room for trees. We mulch around them. All small efforts that collectively, if everyone did similarly, would have an impact. I know many people also take the same approach. And as I said, though, Australia clearly is part of the problem, and we should be part of the solution. The difficulty with the carbon tax proposed by the government is that it's not a solution because it will result in significant cost increases for individuals, couples, families and seniors across Australia. And yet these cost increases will not be accompanied by any substantial reduction in emissions and will not have any noticeable impact on the environment. And while the government is correct to say that many people will be compensated for the impact of the carbon tax, there is a very significant minority of the community which will not be compensated, and they will certainly be worse off. It's interesting that in a radio interview earlier this year, the government's own climate commissioner noted that, and I quote, "If the world as a whole cut all emissions tomorrow, the average temperature of the planet is not going to drop for several hundred years, perhaps over 1,000 years. Figures suggest that Australia contributes only about 1.2% to 1.5% of global emissions. It's a fairly insignificant figure, not a figure we should be proud of though, Madam Deputy Speaker, but it is important given the fact that we are a relatively low emitter. It's important to ensure that we don't introduce measures that will create a cost burden for Australians and for the economy while it will not have any impact on the area it is supposedly designed to improve. The very real threat is that the carbon tax, which is a $9 billion new tax, will see an increase in electricity prices of 10% in the first year alone, and will see other household budgets also adversely impacted upon, like a 9% increase in gas prices. And again, I repeat, there will be no substantial positive benefit for the environment. And while the government tells us that only big polluters will pay, the charge will have flow-on impacts to all sectors of household spending, like grocery prices, as well as impacting on the spending habits of Australians. Their life will become more difficult. It'll be harder for young and not so young people to get a job. And areas like the Sunshine Coast, which I'm privileged to represent in this place, which heavily depend on tourism and construction, will be amongst the areas most badly affected. There have been, Madam Deputy Speaker, suggestions that the carbon tax will have an impact of at least $515 a year on the cost of living of households. It's worth remembering that the price increase brought about by the carbon tax will follow closely on the coattails of massive household price rises in recent years. Madam Deputy Speaker, like the rest of us, you run a household, and you would be aware that in the past 4 years electricity prices have risen on average by 51%, gas prices on average by 30%, water and sewage costs have increased by around 46% for households, health costs by an average 20%, school fees and other education costs by around 24%, and even rent costs by about 20%. Now, I know that it's not popular to quote Lord Monckton, but I understand that Lord Monckton, and I can see the Parliamentary Secretary at the table through his smile, indicates that he doesn't think it's a good thing to quote Lord Monckton, and I recognise his interjection. And I must say, I'm a great admirer of the Parliamentary Secretary. I think that he's really been given a difficult job to sell this unsaleable tax. But if anyone could do it, he certainly could. But I suspect, given the feedback from my community, that even the Parliamentary Secretary's obvious competence is inadequate to turn people's opposition to what is proposed into support for this tax, which will devastate our economy. But I'm told that Lord Monckton suggests that if the Labor government's plan was introduced and emissions were cut by 5% by 2020, pursuant to that plan, it would reduce carbon in the atmosphere by just 0.013 parts per million, from 412 parts per million down to 411.987 parts per million. I think that what the government is focusing on, quite appropriately, is the need for us as a world to do something. However, the plan the government has introduced won't achieve what the government wants to achieve, while at the same time it will make the very existence for many Australian families so much more difficult. Madam Deputy Speaker, I mentioned earlier that the Sunshine Coast is a region which is heavily dependent on tourism, also construction, and tourism is among those industries that are amongst those most vulnerable to a carbon tax and its associated impact on prices. Tourism is a potential big target victim of the carbon tax because it depends so much on the spending power of visitors to the region. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know you've been on the Sunshine Coast and you would be aware that we boast wonderful beaches, a relaxed way of life, modern conveniences, and I know that the area you represent also has wonderful beaches, although the surf is nowhere near as good. The Sunshine Coast has many unspoilt attractions for families. We have our coastline, national parks and walking tracks, camping grounds and caravan parks for reasonably priced family holidays. As well as modern and luxury unit complexes, we've got Australia Zoo, run so effectively by Terry Irwin, who I greatly admire. We've got Aussie World, Ettamogah Pub, Underwater World, the Big Cart Track, as well as the natural attributes of the coast and hinterland and much more. These attractions also help to directly and indirectly provide employment for many people and provide for many families. And yet these attractions depend on the many visitors who come to our area. And yet all of these visitors will have their lives disrupted by the impost of the carbon tax and its associated increases in costs. Households, families, individuals and the elderly around Australia have been finding things extremely difficult, and it's wrong to impose on Australians an additional tax that would see costs rise further and rise dramatically without having any impact on pollution. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been advised that the costs will rise considerably after 3 years when the government's initial set price of $23 per tonne for carbon will no longer be fixed but will become a floating figure out of control of government and at the mercy of market forces. Households will carry the cost and will be forced to cut back in other areas. The government says that the carbon tax is estimated to rise to $29 per tonne in 2016, but the Centre for International Economics suggests that it will be closer to $49 per tonne. The government's figures suggest the figure will rise to $37 per tonne in 2020 and more than $350 per tonne in 2050. And all of these prices are significant, and I just hate to think what it's going to be like for families in the future, given the impact of this carbon tax, if it is not in fact rejected by the Parliament, or in fact if it's not repealed by an incoming government. Also, as I said, the Sunshine Coast has benefited from our construction industry, the building of homes, unit complexes and commercial premises. They've all catered for our growing population and visitors to our region. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it really is unfortunate that the government has decided to proceed with the carbon tax legislation. It's obvious that the community is not in support of this proposal, and what the government really ought to do is to recognise that it has no mandate for this tax. After all, it was the Prime Minister who, prior to the last election, said that there would be no carbon tax under any government I lead. And I consider that if the Prime Minister has changed her mind, and if she has, I certainly respect that, but what she should do is to do what Prime Minister Howard did in 1998 when he changed his mind on the introduction of a GST. As the member for Maranoa points out, the Prime Minister of the day said, look, circumstances are different. While I did say that I would never ever introduce a GST, it was now necessary for the economy, but he gave the people of Australia the opportunity of voting for that change of policy at an election. And really what the government should do, if it feels strongly about its carbon tax legislation, and I suspect that it does, is to say, look, this is the legislation which we plan to bring in if we are returned by the Australian people at the next poll. It's wrong, in my view, to say one thing before an election and then to change one's mind and to change one's policy and to bring in a contrary policy after the election. Madam Deputy Speaker, this legislation cannot be described as good legislation. It will encourage businesses to manufacture offshore. It will encourage people to holiday offshore. It will make it more difficult for young Australians and older Australians to obtain work. And I just think that it's a very heavy price for us as a community to pay to bring in this tax so that we all feel good about it, but ultimately what we're doing is destroying our economy, reducing our competitiveness and assisting countries which are worse emitters than us to actually profit in the international marketplace at our expense. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not too late for the government to withdraw this legislation. It would be in the national interest for it to do so.